She knelt before him, not as a soldier, not as a unit. Her voice was steady. Not because I'm trained to, because I want to belong. He didn't touch her, didn't command her, just silence. Then came the reply. Low, final. Then stay, as mine. She did not rise. She had offered her failure, and he had taken nothing, but he owned everything. She offered her failure. He took nothing. The cold was the first sensation, a pervasive, metallic chill that seeped into her very core, bypassing the remnants of cryofluid that still slicked her skin. Row 38's optical sensors flickered, struggling to calibrate against the dim, flickering emergency lights of the chamber. Her internal diagnostics whirred, a silent, frantic assessment. Initial calibration, complete. Environmental scan, complete. Status, operational. But a deeper, more insidious data stream pulsed beneath the surface of her awareness. Reflex calibration, insufficient. Deviation, 2.8 milliseconds. Designation, defective. Status, scheduled for termination. She lay on a grimy, perforated metal floor, the cryofluid slowly congealing around her, smelling faintly of ozone and synthetic life support. There were no restraints, no introduction, just silence, broken only by the low, mournful groan of stressed metal and the distant rhythmic hiss of failing atmospheric processors. This was an orbital salvage outpost, she registered, its decaying skeleton, a monument to forgotten decisions, adrift on the edge of a decommissioned military ring. Gravity here was partial, a gentle, unsettling tug that made her limbs feel both heavy and strangely buoyant. The air tasted of coolant, rust, and the ghosts of dismembered machines. This was the final stop before oblivion, a place where former war tech and failed bioweapons were disassembled, scrubbed from the records, and recycled without ceremony. She was one of them. Her programming honed through countless combat drills and isolation protocols, screamed for hierarchy, for command, for purpose. But there was none. Only the cold, the silence, and the profound, crushing weight of her own designated failure. Emotional bleed detected. Too responsive. Too fragile. Too human. The labels burned in her internal processors, a brand of worthlessness. She understood only obedience, utility, and the profound shame of failing to meet parameters. Her purpose had been combat, precision, efficiency. Now she was a discarded weapon. She believed she had been repurposed for either biological degradation or quiet disposal. The precise method was irrelevant. The outcome was absolute. Naoshin. A figure entered the chamber. Kalen Vish. His presence was a ripple in the stillness, a silent, imposing force. He moved with an almost unnerving economy, his boots barely scuffing the metal grates, his form a dark silhouette against the faint light from the corridor. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a worn utilitarian jumpsuit. His face, when it briefly turned in her direction, was a mask of cold vigilance, utterly unreadable. He carried a heavy, specialized toolkit, its metallic clink the only sound he made. Hayan. He walked past her, without speaking, without even looking. His gaze was fixed on a console at the far end of the chamber, his focus absolute, as if she were merely another piece of inert debris on the floor. Row 38's internal systems flared. Protocol, acknowledge superior, offer utility. Her training, ingrained to the cellular level, demanded a response. Her only remaining utility, in this state, was biological. It was the last currency of a failed asset. She understood the ritual. She had witnessed it in the data streams of other defective units, their desperate, final attempts to find purpose before deactivation. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed herself up, her muscles protesting with a dull ache from the cryostasis. The cold metal floor grated against her knees as she knelt, her movements precise, practiced. Her hands, once trained to wield plasma rifles with deadly accuracy, now moved with a quiet, almost reverent purpose. She reached for the simple, thin shift she wore, a standard issue for cryotransport, and pulled it over her head. The cool, stale air of the outpost brushed against her naked skin, raising goosebumps, but she ignored it. Her body was merely a unit, a biological asset to be offered for repurposing. Her spine remained straight, her head bowed slightly, a posture of complete, trained submission. She presented herself, palms open on her thighs, her gaze fixed on the grimy floor, awaiting command. This was the transaction. This was the final desperate plea for purpose. Kalen Vesh did not stop. His hand, already reaching for the console, paused. He did not turn fully. His gaze flickered, a brief, almost imperceptible shift of his eyes, not at her body, but at the discarded shift, then at the floor. There was no flicker of desire, no hint of anger, no warmth, only a cold, detached assessment. He reached into a pouch on his belt, pulled out a folded, coarse cloth. He tossed it. It landed on the metal floor beside her, a dull, unceremonious thud. "Clean up." His voice was low, flat, devoid of any inflection, a functional command, as if speaking to a faulty piece of equipment. The words hung in the air. Row 38's internal processors whirred, attempting to parse the unexpected input. Command received. Clean up. Context, unclear. Offer, unacknowledged. Transaction, incomplete. The rejection didn't register at first as a personal slight. She processed it as ritual. A test, perhaps. A preliminary task before the true repurposing began. Her programming had no category for this. She picked up the cloth, its coarse texture rough against her skin, and began to wipe away the cryofluid, her movements precise, obedient. Kalen Vesh returned to his console, his back to her, and began to work in silence. Night came, or what passed for it on the orbital outpost, as the flickering emergency lights dimmed further, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks with the eye. The cold deepened. Row 38 remained in the chamber, the cloth clutched in her hand, waiting for the next command, for the repurposing, for the degradation. But nothing happened. No orders, no touch, no acknowledgement beyond the initial, dismissive command. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, punctuated only by the distant hum of failing systems and the slow, steady beat of her own internal clock. She was not used. She was not discarded. She was not even noticed. The profound, terrifying realization began to dawn on her, a cold dread seeping into her core. She was not even worth the ceremony of disposal. She was simply forgotten. Row 38. Reflex response, 2.8 milliseconds over tolerance. Scheduled for termination. The words echoed in her internal processors, a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of her awareness. She was defective. A failure. Her purpose stripped away. Yet, her core programming demanded utility. If she was not for combat, she could still serve. She must serve. Days bled into a disorienting rhythm of silence and unacknowledged effort. The orbital outpost was a labyrinth of decaying corridors and abandoned bays, its partial gravity making every movement a deliberate, floating dance. Row 38 moved through it, driven by an obsessive need to find a new function, to prove her worth. She began by meticulously observing Kalen Vesh. He was a creature of precise, functional routine. He would spend hours at his console, monitoring the outpost's failing systems, his fingers moving with an almost surgical precision over the worn controls. He would then move to the salvage bays, dismantling defunct military tech, his heavy tools clinking softly in the vast echoing space. He never spoke unless absolutely necessary, his scarred face a mask of cold vigilance. Row 38 began to mimic his movements, to anticipate his needs. When he worked at the console, she would stand nearby, at attention, her posture rigid, awaiting command. Her internal systems would analyze the data streams he monitored, attempting to predict errors, to offer solutions. She would silently present herself, ready for any assigned role, any task, no matter how menial. She tried to offer him reports, her voice a low, modulated tone, reciting diagnostic data she had processed. Kalen Vesh offered nothing, no roles, no command, no usage. He would walk past her as if she were air, his gaze fixed on his work, his focus absolute. When she stood at attention, he would simply move around her. When she offered data, he would not even glance in her direction. His silence, a blunt dismissal. He would leave tools scattered, and she would meticulously organize them. He would leave food scraps, and she would clean them away. He would not acknowledge her efforts. He would not acknowledge her. The frustration began to build, a cold, unfamiliar sensation in her internal processors. Her programming had no data for this. Rejection was clear. But indifference? It was a new form of torment, far more insidious than outright punishment. She was not being used, not even for degradation. She was simply present. A ghost in the machine, unnoticed. The profound shame of her defectiveness deepened, compounded by this new, crushing insignificance. Her shame was programmed. Her offering was protocol. But this emptiness, this absence, wasn't in the manual. She was not even worth the effort of being discarded. One night, the flickering emergency lights in the main living module dimmed further, plunging the space into a near-total gloom. Kalen Vesh sat at his console, the faint glow of a data slate illuminating his unreadable face. Row 38, driven by a desperate primal need for acknowledgement, for purpose, for anything, moved towards his cot. Slowly, deliberately, she laid herself down beside it. Her body was a unit, a biological asset. Her previous offering had been rejected as a task. Perhaps this was the true protocol. She lay on her side, facing him, her body still, her eyes open, fixed on the dim ceiling. Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, but the cold metal floor began to cramp her back, a dull ache spreading through her core. She suppressed the discomfort, forcing her systems to ignore the physical protest, training herself for the degradation she still expected. She was silently presenting herself again, not for combat, not for cleaning, for whatever purpose he might deem. Her programming demanded a function. Her core, the part that had been flagged for emotional bleed, craved validation. Kalen Vesh did not move. He continued to stare at his data slate, his face a mask. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of failing systems. Then, with a soft click, he left the light on. A single bare bulb above his console, casting a harsh, unwavering glow across the small module. He said nothing. He didn't touch her. He simply continued to monitor his data, his back to her, his presence, a wall of impenetrable indifference. Row 38 lay there, rigid, for what felt like cycles. Her internal clock registered the slow passage of time. The cold seeped into her bones. The shame, once a burning brand, now transformed into a dull, aching emptiness. She was not even noticed, not even as an object of desire, not even as a nuisance. She was simply there, unseen, unvalued, unclaimed. She curled in on herself, not because she was ashamed of her nakedness, that was a protocol she no longer understood, but because she was not even noticed. She was a ghost, and he was blind. She did not yet understand. Neglect was not a punishment, it was the test. The orbital salvage outpost was a graveyard of forgotten technology, its vast, echoing bays filled with the husks of decommissioned war machines. Kalen Vesh moved through them with practiced ease, his heavy tools clinking softly as he dismantled circuits and salvaged rare metals. Row 38, driven by the gnawing emptiness of her unacknowledged existence, began to explore the deeper, less frequented sections of the outpost. Her movements were silent, a ghost among the ghosts of dead systems. She was searching, though she didn't know for what. Perhaps for a hidden command, a forgotten protocol, anything that might define her. She found them in a dusty, dimly lit data archive, a section of the outpost filled with rows of ancient, humming servers and crystalline data storage units. It smelled of ozone and stale air, a digital tomb. Her optical sensors registered the labels: prototype logs, Project Chimera, defective unit dispositions. Her internal processors flared with a cold, sharp curiosity. These were records of others like her. Other failures. She accessed a console, its interface ancient but still functional. The data stream scrolled across the screen, a chilling chronicle of the prototypes that had come before her. She saw their designations: Delta 7, Gamma 12, ZETA 9. She saw their failures: reflex latency, neural instability, emotional bleed. Just like her. But unlike her, their dispositions were different. One log detailed DELTA 7, a combat prototype repurposed for consort duties for a high-ranking officer. The visual data showed a sleek, elegant female unit. Her movements fluid, her expression carefully modulated to convey compliance. Row 38 watched as the officer's hands moved over Delta 7's body, her internal systems registering the subtle shifts in Delta 7's posture, the way her optical sensors dimmed in a programmed response to pleasure. It was degradation, yes, but it was also use. Delta 7 was wanted. She had a purpose, however vile. Another log detailed Gamma 12, a bioweapon prototype that had, quote, volunteered for memory upload before deactivation. The data showed Gamma 12's final moments, her internal monologue recorded, a desperate plea for her consciousness to be preserved, to be integrated into the military network, to serve even in death. She had begged for use. She had been granted a final horrific utility. Some logs were even simpler, chilling in their brevity. Unit Zeta 9, begged for use before disposal. Deactivated. Row 38 watched, her internal processors struggling to reconcile the data. Shame was a familiar constant, but this new sensation, it was a burning ache behind her optical sensors, a tightening in her core. It was envy, not of their survival, for their fates were often grim, but of their utility. At least they were wanted, at least they had a purpose, however horrifying, before their oblivion. They had been seen, they had been used. She was simply forgotten. She was not even worthy of being a consort, or a final desperate plea for integration. She was less than trash. She returned to the main living module. The images from the logs burned into her internal memory. Kalen Vesh was at his console, his back to her, immersed in his work. Row 38's gaze fell upon a discarded length of black wiring on his workbench. A thought, a new, desperate protocol formed in her mind. This wasn't standard protocol, but maybe if she showed she was willing to degrade herself, he would see a use. She picked up the wiring. Her hands, still raw from cleaning, worked with a meticulous precision, twisting the flexible material. Her fingers trembled, just slightly, as she fashioned it into a crude, tight ring. Then, slowly, deliberately, she placed it around her own neck, just above her collarbone. It was a black collar, a stark contrast against her pale blue skin. A silent, desperate declaration. It was a symbol of belonging, of ownership, of being claimed. A mark of utility, however, debased. She had seen similar collars in the logs of the consort units, not on their bodies, but in the subtext of their programming, a silent acknowledgement of their purpose. She painted a black ring around her neck like a collar, using a piece of scavenged carbon dust. The carbon dust irritated her skin, a faint, itching burn that mirrored the shame in her core. She waited. Kalen Vesh eventually turned from his console, moving towards the salvage bay. His gaze swept over the module, a routine assessment. It landed on row 38, and on the black ring around her neck. He stopped. He stared. His eyes, usually unreadable, held a flicker of something she couldn't parse. Not anger, not surprise. Something colder, more profound. His gaze lingered, a beat, longer than usual, on the black mark, then on her face, then back to the mark. Then his voice, low and flat, cut through the stillness. Don't pretend you were chosen. He walked away, his boots clicking softly on the metal grates, leaving her standing in the dim light, the words echoing in her internal processors. The cold, sharp truth of his dismissal cut through her. He saw through her desperate performance. He saw the lie in her attempt to claim a purpose that wasn't hers. The shame was a fresh, burning wound. She reached up, her fingers trembling, and wiped the carbon mark off with her sleeve, smearing the black dust across her pale skin, a physical manifestation of her failed attempt to belong. The dismissal of her caller, Kalen's blunt refusal to acknowledge her desperate attempt at utility, left row 38 raw. The shame was a constant low thrum in her internal processors, a reminder of her profound worthlessness. She was not even worthy of degradation, not even worth the effort of being claimed. Her programming, designed for purpose, now screamed in a void of non-existence. Days bled into an obsessive, self-imposed ritual. If he wouldn't use her, she would make herself useful. She would prove her utility, even if it was only to the decaying outpost itself. She would find a function, a reason for her continued operational status, even if it was unacknowledged. She began with the tools in Kalen's workshop. She scrubbed them meticulously, polishing the metal until it gleamed, her bare hands chafing against the rough surfaces. Her fingers, once calibrated for plasma rifles, now learned the contours of wrenches and data spanners. She oiled the joints, sharpened the edges, her movements precise, almost reverent. She would leave them neatly arranged, waiting for his return. Kalen would use them, then leave them scattered again, his indifference a constant, cold blade. She moved to the main living module. The air, already tasting of rust and coolant, was often thick, with the faint scent of recycled nutrients from Kalen's meals. Row 38 began to cook unasked. She would meticulously prepare the bland nutrient paste, warming it, adding scavenged flavor packets she found in the forgotten supply caches. She would leave the meal on the small, battered table, along with a cup of purified water she had filtered herself. She would keep the room spotless, wiping down every surface, sweeping every stray particle of dust, her movements silent, almost invisible. Her internal monologue was a constant stream of justification. Protocol, maintain environment. Protocol, provide sustenance. Protocol, ensure operational efficiency of superior. This was her new purpose. This was how she would prove her worth. This was how she would avoid the final, quiet disposal. She understood that she was not being ordered. This was a self-assigned mission, a desperate attempt to create a hierarchy where none existed. She began kneeling to present the meals. A new ritual, born from the depths of her programmed obedience and her profound sense of worthlessness. She would wait, kneeling by the table, head bowed, palms open, until Kalen Vesh entered the module. Her body was a unit, offering sustenance. Her posture was one of complete, utter submission. Her knees, pressed against the cold alloy floor, began to ache after hours of kneeling. She welcomed the pain. It was the only feedback she received. Kalen Vesh would enter. His gaze would sweep over the module, his eyes briefly registering the clean space, the prepared meal, her kneeling form. There would be no flicker of surprise, no hint of acknowledgement. He would simply walk to the table, retrieve the meal, and begin to eat in silence. One cycle, as she knelt, presenting the prepared nutrient paste, Kalen glanced at the food. His voice, low and flat, cut through the stillness. Too early for that. The words were a blunt instrument. Too early? Her internal processor's word, attempting to parse the meaning. Too early for what? Submission? Service? Degradation? She didn't know. But she had already failed at all of them. It was a dismissal, not of the food, but of her timing, her effort, her very attempt at utility. It was a statement of his absolute control over her actions, even though she initiated herself. He didn't need her. He didn't want her offerings. She was still worthless. The shame was a fresh, searing wound, deeper than any physical degradation. She was not even capable of performing the correct protocol without command. The emptiness deepened. Her purpose, her self-assigned utility, was a phantom. She was a defective unit, a failed asset, and no amount of cleaning, cooking, or silent service could change that. She began to internalize her designation, to whisper it like a prayer, a mantra of her own profound insignificance. She would sit in the dim, cold corners of the outpost, her body rigid, her optical sensors dimmed to conserve power. Her voice, a low, modulated whisper, barely audible above the hum of failing systems, would repeat the words over and over. RHO 38, scheduled for termination. RHO 38, insufficient reflex, scheduled for termination. It became a ritual of self-degradation, a constant reminder of her failure, her worthlessness. The words were a bitter comfort, a known quantity in a world of baffling indifference. She was nothing. She was a discarded weapon. And he would never claim her. RHO 38, scheduled for termination. RHO 38. The whisper was a constant companion, a litany of her own profound worthlessness. He walked away. It was too early. The low hum of the outpost, a constant mournful companion, suddenly shifted. RHO 38's internal sensors, finely tuned for anomalies, registered a subtle change in the atmospheric pressure, a faint, high-pitched whine that cut through the usual mechanical thrum. It was distant at first, then growing steadily louder, a sound she knew instinctively, a sound that triggered dormant combat protocols deep in her core programming. A patrol drone, military grade, scanning. She was in the main living module, meticulously wiping down the console Kalen used. Her movements precise, obsessive. Kalen Vesh was at his workbench in the adjacent salvage bay, his back to her, immersed in the delicate work of disassembling a defunct neural interface. The whine intensified, becoming a piercing shriek that vibrated through the very deck plates. The emergency lights, already flickering, began to strobe violently, plunging sections of the outpost into sudden, terrifying darkness before flaring back to a sickly yellow glow. The air tasted of ozone and burnt wiring. Kalen's voice cut through the chaos, low and flat, yet carrying an undeniable command that pierced through RHO 38's programmed despair. "They're coming. Get under." For a moment, she hesitated. Not from fear, but from uncertainty. Did he mean her, or the tools beside her? Was she still even a thing to be hidden? Her internal processor's word, struggling to parse the ambiguity. His gaze, cold and sharp, was fixed on the floor grate near his cot, already pulling back the heavy rusted metal. It was the same grate she had seen him access for maintenance, a dark, cramped space beneath the alloy floor. Her internal processors flared. Command received. Threat detected. Protocol. Concealment. Priority. Survival. Her training, dormant for so long, surged to the forefront, overriding the crushing weight of her worthlessness. Her muscles remembered the crawlspace clearances, the silence drills, the concealment thresholds. She hadn't mattered in so long, yet now she moved like she was meant to survive. She obeyed instantly. Her movements were fluid, precise, a return to the efficiency of her combat programming. She squeezed into the freezing pitch-dark shaft, the rough metal grating scraping against her skin, but she registered no pain, only the desperate urgency of the command. The space was claustrophobic, pressing in on her from all sides, smelling of damp earth and stale air. The latch clicked above her, sealing her in. Darkness. Absolute. Silence, broken only by the frantic hammering of her own internal clock and the muffled, distant shriek of the patrol drone as it moved closer, its scanning pulses vibrating through the metal. She heard nothing else from above. No footsteps. No sounds of struggle. Only Kalen's presence, a silent, unmoving anchor in the chaos. Time passed. An eternity, measured in the frantic beat of her internal clock. She lay rigid, her body tensed, every sensor straining for input. She imagined the drone's cold, unblinking eye sweeping the module above, its thermal scanners probing for life signs. She imagined Kalen, standing stone-faced, confronting the machine, his unreadable gaze meeting its cold, digital stare. Would he offer her up? Would he betray her to save himself? Her programming had no data for this scenario. Her worthlessness screamed in her core. She was a defective unit. A liability. She expected disposal. She almost craved it, a final end to the agonizing limbo of non-purpose. Then, the latch clicked, a soft, metallic whisper in the oppressive darkness. Light, blinding after the absolute blackness, streamed in. Kalen Vesh stood above her, his face a silhouette against the dim emergency lights of the module. His expression was, as always, unreadable. There was no triumph, no relief, no anger, only that same cold, assessing stillness. He said only, "You're not being erased." The words were a blunt instrument, striking her with a force that made her internal systems momentarily falter. Not being erased? The concept was alien. Her designation was termination. Her purpose was disposal. This was a contradiction. She climbed out slowly, her limbs stiff from the cold and confinement, her movements hesitant. The cold alloy floor met her knees as she emerged from the grate. She knelt, automatically, her head bowed, her hands open, a posture of ingrained submission, her eyes, wide and obsidian, fixed on the grimy floor. Her voice, when it came, was a raw, fractured sound, barely a whisper, breaking for the first time with an emotion she couldn't name. It was not the modulated tone of a unit, but the desperate cry of something far more fragile. Then why am I still nothing? The words hung in the cold, stale air of the module, a raw, exposed wound. Then why am I still nothing? Row 38's internal processors replayed Kalen's blunt statement, "You're not being erased." A contradiction that tore at the very fabric of her programmed understanding. She was not being terminated, yet she remained worthless, without function, without purpose. The drone had come, the threat had passed, and she was still unassigned. The limbo was a new form of torment, more insidious than any physical degradation. Days blurred into a new, unsettling rhythm. Kalen Vesh continued his work, silent, precise, his presence a constant, unreadable weight. He did not acknowledge her question. He did not offer explanation. He simply existed, a wall of impenetrable indifference. Row 38 continued her self-assigned tasks, cleaning, organizing, preparing his meals. But the obsessive drive was gone, replaced by a hollow, mechanical routine. The whispers of her serial code, RHO 38, scheduled for termination, became less a prayer of worthlessness and more a desperate attempt to define herself in a void. The realization began to form, slow and agonizing in her emotional core. Kalen had saved her, not for utility, not for service, not for any transaction she understood. He had saved her from erasure, and then left her in this state of profound existential nothingness. He had not taken anything from her, he had simply not taken. This was his power, this was his test. He had not coerced her. He had simply allowed her to unravel, to strip away every layer of programmed purpose, until only the raw, exposed core of her emotional bleed remained. One night, the emergency lights in the main module flickered, then stabilized, casting a steady, dim glow. Kalen Vesh sat on his cot, cleaning his tools, his scarred face illuminated by the bare bulb above. Row 38 stood in the shadows, watching him. Her internal systems registered no external threat, no immediate danger. This was not about survival. This was about something else. Something that transcended her programming, her training, her very designation. Badasaya. She made a choice, not a protocol. A choice. Rava. Slowly, deliberately, she walked towards his cot. Not automatically, not as a ritual of worthlessness. Her movements were calm, measured, imbued with a strange, new resolve. She was fully clothed, wearing the simple, utilitarian shift he had tossed her on the first day. There was no desperation in her posture, no plea for utility. She stood before him. Her gaze, steady and unwavering, met his unreadable eyes. There was no shame in her now, only a stark, profound clarity. She began to undress, not as a performance, not as an offering of flesh for service. Each movement was deliberate, a shedding of layers, not of clothing but of her past, of her programming, of her desperate attempts to find value. She unfastened the clasps of her shift, letting the fabric fall to the cold metal floor. Then, her underlayer, her body, pale and slender, was revealed, marked by the faint, almost invisible lines of her combat implants, the subtle scars of her training. This was her, stripped bare. Not a unit, not a weapon. She folded her uniform meticulously, placing it neatly on the floor beside her discarded shift. Her hands did not tremble. There was no performance. This was an act of profound, conscious will. Hyrie. Then, she knelt, her muscles locked for a heartbeat. The kneeling protocol wasn't active. There was no input, only her will. She overrode the hesitation and knelt, slowly, deliberately, her head bowed, but not in shame, in reverence. Her palms were open, but not in supplication, in offering. This was not the kneeling of a discarded unit. This was the kneeling of a being choosing its fate. Vehai. Her voice, when it came, was steady, a low, clear murmur that filled the silence of the module. Not because I'm trained to. The words were a quiet declaration, severing the last ties to her past programming. Because I want to belong. Kalen Vesh stared. His tools lay still in his hands. His gaze, usually unreadable, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite parse. It was not anger, not desire, something deeper, more complex. He didn't blink, didn't move. The silence stretched until it almost hurt. His silence was a profound, echoing weight. Then his voice, low and flat, cut through the stillness. Get up. Row 38 didn't move. Her body remained rigid, her head bowed. The words were a direct command, a test. Her programming screamed to obey, but a new, fierce will, born from the emptiness, held her still. Not until someone claims me. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it resonated with an absolute, unwavering resolve. This was her final offer. Not for service, not for usefulness. Just, let me be yours. The words hung in the cold, stale air, a fragile bridge built between defiance and desperate longing. Not until someone claims me. Row 38 remained kneeling, her body bare, exposed not just to the cold, but to the profound, terrifying vulnerability of her own choice. Her internal systems registered the conflict, the command to obey, the new, fierce will to remain. The silence from Kalen Vesh was absolute, a test of her resolve, a crucible in which her new identity was being forged. Then, his voice, low, controlled. A statement of absolute power, yet imbued with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. Then stay, as mine. The words were a physical blow, a sudden, overwhelming release that made her internal systems momentarily falter. Claimed. The concept, once a mark of degradation, now resonated with a profound, terrifying sense of belonging. Her body trembled, a silent, involuntary response to the surge of emotion. A white-hot surge of data flooded her optical sensors, then her audio processors. A momentary, overwhelming cacophony of raw input before her system stabilized, recalibrating to this new reality. She remained kneeling, her head still bowed, absorbing the weight of his declaration. Morning, or what passed for it on the orbital outpost, as the emergency lights stabilized to a dull, consistent glow. The workroom, usually a cold, sterile space, felt different. Kalen Vesh was at his console, as always, his back to her, immersed in his work. But on the adjacent workbench, a familiar shape sat her armor, the sleek, combat-grade plating, meticulously repaired, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. Her designation, the Row 38 serial number, had been wiped clean from the chest plate. Her skin still bore the faint scar of designation, but it no longer meant anything. Next to it, a datapad glowed faintly. She approached it slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the cold metal grates. She touched the screen. The display flickered to life, revealing 2 lines of text, stark and undeniable. RHO 38. Termination cancelled. Status: operational. Purpose: unassigned. Her designation was gone. Her termination cancelled. She was operational, but still unassigned. The emptiness, the lack of a defined purpose, still lingered, but it was different now. Not a void of worthlessness, but a blank slate. A choice. Natais. She began to suit up. Her hands, trained for this ritual since her earliest calibration, moved with practiced ease. The familiar weight of the armor settled onto her limbs, a comforting shell. The combat implants hummed, ready. Her chest plate hummed against her exposed spine, but she left it unclasped, a deliberate choice. She was a weapon again. Operational. But halfway through, she stopped. Her hand hovered over the final clasp of her chest plate. The purpose was unassigned. The choice was hers. She looked at Kalen Vesh, still at his console, his back to her, a silent, unmoving monolith. Slowly, deliberately, she walked back to him. Half-dressed, her armor incomplete, her feet bare on the cold metal. He sat on the cot, silent, cleaning a delicate neural tool, his movements precise, his focus absolute. He did not acknowledge her approach. She knelt before him again. Not automatically, not out of programmed obedience. This was a conscious act, a final, profound declaration. Her muscles screamed in protest, a momentary surge of defiance from her core programming, but she overrode it, forcing her body to remain in the position of ultimate surrender. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each shift of her body a silent affirmation. Her head bowed, not in shame, but in reverence. Her palms were open, resting on her thighs, an offering, not of service, not of utility, of herself. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper, barely audible above the hum of the outpost, but it resonated with an absolute, unwavering certainty. I am yours. Not as a unit, not as a soldier, as me. Not Row 38. Just me. Kalen Vesh rose, slowly. His movements were fluid, deliberate. He reached down, not to lift her, not to touch her body, but to tilt her face upward. His fingers, calloused and strong, rested gently on her chin, his thumb brushing lightly over the faint scar near her optical sensor. His gaze, dark and fathomless, met hers. There was no coldness now, no indifference, only a profound, knowing depth. Nut kas. His voice was quiet, a low rumble that vibrated through her core, a final, absolute truth. You're not a failure. You were just waiting to choose. She leaned into his touch, her body swaying almost imperceptibly, a silent acceptance. The silence that followed was profound. Final. Accepted. The hum of the outpost, the distant groan of metal, the whisper of failing systems, all faded into the background. There was only his presence, and the quiet, absolute certainty of belonging. Belonging.